Welcome to How to Play Horus Heresy 3rd Edition. In this video, we will be covering flyers. The Age of Darkness saw a huge variety of vehicles and war machines deployed to the many battlefields of the Horus Heresy, and on the tabletop, one of the most unique and effective is the flyer. A flyer is a unique type of vehicle that you can deploy in your battles of Horus Heresy. Although they share many similarities with other vehicles, such as armour and weapon emplacement, they function entirely differently and therefore have their own unique rule set. The core rules for flyers can be found in the Age of Darkness Rulebook, pages 224 to 228. All the rules in this video represent your flyers streaking over the battlefield at high speed, having an instantaneous and massive effect on the battlefield before shooting off into the local airspace. First of all, let's talk about what a flyer is. All flyers will have the flyer subtype, and regardless of size or function, will adhere to some common rules. When a flyer is on the table, it never blocks line of sight. It also does not block the movement of other models. As it is in the air, it does not interact with ground-based forces or block their vision. As flyers are moving through the air, they ignore all rules and effects for terrain and are never hindered by difficult, dangerous, or impassable terrain. However, if a flyer moves, it can never end its movement on a terrain feature, impassable terrain, or a building. No model may ever join a flyer, or vice versa. Flyers never gain tactical statuses and ignore any and all rules which inflict them. This includes the shock rule. Because of this, flyers can never have a status inflicted as part of a roll on the vehicle damage table. If this is ever required, the flyer takes 1 point of hull damage instead. As a flyer is moving at such high speed, it can never be assaulted, blocked in combat, or interacted with by enemy models in any way during the assault phase. Flyers cannot make normal reactions. They can only make reactions if that reaction clearly states it can be made by models with the flyer subtype. And finally, if a flyer is ever reduced to 0 hull points or is otherwise removed as a casualty, then it comes apart in the air. It is removed from the battlefield immediately with no further effect on the battle. Flyers have the same profile setup as any other vehicle. It will have a subtype which will always be Vehicle Flyer. Some will also have the Transport Vehicle subtype or the Super Heavy subtype also. They have a movement stat and a ballistic skill stat, meaning they can both move and shoot. They also have 3 armour facings like any other vehicle. However, all flyers will have the same armour value across all 3 of their facings. If a flyer has an armour value of 13 on its front facing, then its other facings will also be armour value 13 as well. Flyers have hull points like any other vehicle, representing the amount of damage they can take before being destroyed. When hull points are reduced to 0, they will be removed as a casualty. And finally, some flyers will have a transport capacity, highlighting the amount of models that can be embarked within them. Flyers will also likely have a set of weapons, along with firing arcs for each. Hull-mounted weapons will have arcs that align with the vehicle facing they are attached to. Centerline will always be directly in front or behind of the vehicle, using the edges of the hull as the firing arc. Sponson arcs will be the sides of the vehicle, split along its central axis. Turret and pintle-mounted weapons will have 360-degree firing arcs, and finally, coaxial weapons will share the firing arc with whatever other weapon they are attached to and must always attack the same model if used. The rules for making shooting attacks with flyers will generally be much the same as other vehicles, but can be impacted by how you bring them onto the table and how you use them. As mentioned, some flyers, like the Cestus Assault Ram, will have the Transport subtype, meaning models can be embarked within them like any other transport vehicle. During the start phase of your turn, you can choose to embark one of your reserve units or models in that transport. This unit can have Specialists, Command, or Paragon models attached also and still count as one unit. The unit cannot exceed the flyer's transport capacity, and the flyer can only contain appropriate models. No trying to jam a Saturnine Dreadnought into an Arvis Lighter. Once a unit is embarked on a transport flyer, it must stay within that flyer until it can disembark onto the battlefield. It cannot be removed or changed while still in reserves. Once the unit has disembarked successfully and the flyer returns to aerial reserves, then another unit from reserves may be embarked within it following all the previously mentioned points. Because flyers move at such high speeds and are so separate from the rest of the battle unfolding below, you will use them differently from other units in your army. First of all, when deploying your army, do not deploy your flyers with the rest of your models. Instead, you will place the flyer into what is called aerial reserves. This is similar to, but completely separate from, regular reserves. Rules or interactions that affect reserves do not interact with aerial reserves, unless the rule uses the term aerial reserves specifically. As such, your flyer will start off of the table. Here, I have a force deployed ready to fight. I have put 2 tactical squads into reserves and my flyer into aerial reserves. Although they are both off the table in reserves, they are 2 completely separate things. One of my models on the table has a command Vox Relay that makes reserves rolls easier to achieve. This affects only my 2 tactical squads in reserves, not my flyer. In order to bring a flyer out of aerial reserves, you roll a reserves test, just like other reserves in the reserve subphase of the main movement phase. This is done from turn 1 onward. Initially, to bring a flyer on from aerial reserves, the test is set at 3+. This means you need to roll 3 or more on a d6 to successfully pass the test. You must roll an aerial reserves test for each flyer you have in aerial reserves every turn starting from the first, just like you would for regular reserves. On the roll of a 3+, the flyer is eligible to enter play from aerial reserves and must be given a combat mission to complete. At this point, I think it's important to mention that there is some contradiction in the rulebook regarding this specifically. On page 226, the book states that a flyer must be given a combat mission and enter play immediately during the reserve subphase if it passes this test. However, on page 242, when discussing reserves, the book states that the player may choose to either leave the unit in reserves or to immediately bring into play from reserves or aerial reserves. Now, looking at rules as written, the flyer must be brought onto the table when it passes the test. However, rules as intended may wish them to function more like regular reserves, giving the player more control. In this instant, as with all rules in the game, I would have a discussion with your opponent at the start of the game about how you both wish to play that specific rule, until Games Workshop can FAQ this. If the aerial reserves test is failed, then the flyer remains in aerial reserve until the next turn, when it can be tested for again. If the test is passed, then the flyer must be given a combat assignment. A combat assignment is a specific task that your commander sets for the flyer to achieve in the reserve subphase. Then, in that turn, the flyer will try to achieve that single objective before leaving the battlefield with a roar of superheated engines. All flyers return to aerial reserves once their mission is completed successfully. There are 4 combat assignments and 1 advanced reaction for flyers. The first 2 combat assignments are for transport flyers specifically. Drop mission. The flyer lands or hovers over the battlefield just long enough to allow embarked units to disembark, providing some limited covering fire before rocketing back out of the combat zone. Extraction mission. The flyer screams onto the battlefield to rescue a friendly unit, landing or hovering just long enough to allow a friendly model to embark while it provides minimal covering fire. It then flies out of the hot zone with the embarked model safe within. The next 2 missions are offensive missions for flyers with weapons. Strike mission. The flyer rockets onto the field, unleashing its front-mounted weaponry in a blitz of firepower before screaming away with a boom of displaced air. As it's flying at high speed, its fire may not be particularly accurate, but it will be devastating if it hits. Strafing Run. The flyer approaches the battlefield at a much more controlled speed or hovers over the ground, unleashing its full weapon suite at full effect. However, it is a much easier target for enemies to hit and puts the flyer at much higher risk. It will then fly back out of the combat zone if it survives. There is also one flyer-specific advanced reaction known as Combat Air Patrol, where one of your flyers comes onto the table to shoot down an enemy flyer. This is done on your opponent's turn and uses up a point of your reaction allowance. The flyer will then return to aerial reserves upon completing the Combat Air Patrol. At the end of all combat assignments, and assuming your flyer survives, it will return to aerial reserves and start the process all over again next turn. Let's talk about how each combat assignment is completed and how you can use your flyer to complete them. I will also have a face tracker at the side of the screen so you can see exactly when each part of the assignment takes place. The drop mission is for flyers with both a transport capacity and another unit embarked within them. Once assigned a drop mission in the reserve subphase, a flyer must immediately be placed anywhere along a battlefield edge in the controlling player's deployment zone. Note that this only applies to the first turn. If this mission is assigned from turn 2 onward, then the flyer can be placed on any board edge. Once the flyer is placed, this can trigger the Intercept reaction, which will always be made as snapshots unless another rule overrules this. In the move subphase, the flyer may move up to its maximum movement value in a straight line. This must be in the direction the flyer is facing. It cannot pivot and it cannot turn. Note, it does not need to move at all, but it never counts as stationary as it is entering play from reserves. Once this movement is completed, a combat air patrol reaction can be declared by the enemy player. If the flyer survives, then any units within the flyer may disembark using all the normal rules for disembarking from vehicles. The edge of the flyer's base is the access point in this scenario. Models that disembark from flyers can both shoot and assault normally. This movement can trigger reactions that are made in the movement phase. Then, in the shooting phase, the flyer can make shooting attacks with all of its defensive weapons. As a vehicle, it can split fire so long as all targets are within its weapon's firing arcs and line of sight. This shooting attack can trigger reactions that are made in the shooting phase. And then once the shooting phase is completed, the flyer then leaves the table and returns to aerial reserves. Next, let's look at the extraction mission. Only flyers with the transport subtype can complete extraction missions, and no unit should be embarked within the flyer beforehand. Once assigned an extraction mission in the reserve subphase, a flyer must immediately be placed anywhere along a battlefield edge in the controlling player's deployment zone. Note that this only applies to the first turn. If this mission is assigned from turn 2 onward, then the flyer can be placed on any board edge. Once the flyer is placed, this can trigger an Intercept reaction, which will always be made as snapshots unless another special rule overrules this. Then, in the move subphase, the flyer may move up to its maximum movement value in a straight line. This must be in the direction the flyer is facing. It cannot pivot and it cannot turn. Note, it does not need to move at all, but it never counts as stationary as it is entering play from reserves. Once this movement ends, a combat air patrol reaction can be declared by the enemy player. Once this movement is completed, any units wholly within 2 inches of the flyer may embark upon it using its base as an access point. This can include both routed and pinned units. Once the unit is embarked, it immediately loses any tactical statuses it may have had. This movement can also trigger reactions that are made in the movement phase. Then, in the shooting phase, the flyer can make shooting attacks with all of its defensive weapons. As a vehicle, it can split fire so long as all targets are within its weapon's firing arcs and line of sight. This shooting attack can trigger reactions that are made in the shooting phase. Then, once the shooting phase is completed, the flyer then leaves the table and returns to aerial reserves. If a flyer successfully completes an extraction mission, then the unit embarked within it must remain embarked within it. The first of the offensive flyer missions is known as the Strike mission. Once assigned a strike mission in the reserve subphase, a flyer must immediately be placed anywhere along a battlefield edge in the controlling player's deployment zone. Note that this only applies to the first turn. If this mission is assigned from turn 2 onward, then the flyer can be placed on any board edge. Once the flyer is placed, this can trigger the Intercept reaction, which will always be made as snapshots, unless another special rule overrides this. In the move subphase, the flyer may move up to its maximum movement value in a straight line. This must be in the direction the flyer is facing, and it cannot turn and it cannot pivot. Note that it does not need to move at all, but it never counts as stationary as it is entering play from reserves. Once this movement ends, a combat air patrol reaction can be declared by the enemy player. This movement can also trigger other reactions that are made in the movement phase. Also note that any models embarked within the flyer may not disembark at this point, and no models on the board may embark onto the flyer either. This is a combat mission. Then, in the shooting phase, the flyer can make shooting attacks as follows. only centerline arc weapons or weapons with the guided missile trait may be fired. And all centerline arc weapons that are fired will be fired as snapshots. Note that this shooting attack can trigger reactions that are made in the shooting phase. Once the shooting phase is completed, the flyer then leaves the table and returns to aerial reserves. The final combat assignment is the Strafing Run. Once assigned a Strafing Run mission in the reserve subphase, a flyer must immediately be placed anywhere along a battlefield edge in the controlling player's deployment zone. Note that this only applies to the first turn. If this mission is assigned from turn 2 onward, then the flyer can be placed on any board edge. Once the flyer is placed, this can trigger the Intercept reaction, but in this instance it will be made at full ballistic skill. The flyer is a much easier target to hit during the Strafing Run. In the move subphase, the flyer can then move in any direction. However, it can only move up to a maximum of half of its movement value. As it does not need to move in a straight line, it can pivot also. Then, at the end of this movement, a combat air patrol reaction can be declared by your opponent. And this movement can also trigger reactions that are made in the movement phase. Also, any models embarked within the flyer may not disembark, and no models on the board may embark on the flyer either. Again, this is a combat mission. Then, in the shooting phase, the flyer can make shooting attacks with every weapon it has at full ballistic skill, following all the rules for its various ranges and firing arcs. These shooting attacks can trigger reactions that are made in the shooting phase. Once the shooting phase is completed, the flyer then leaves the table and returns to aerial reserves. After a flyer returns to aerial reserves from any mission, the player can then declare that it is leaving the combat space and remove the model completely from play. This includes any models embarked within it. The model is removed, but it does not count as a casualty for kill point based missions and no longer requires an aerial reserves test each turn. It takes no further part in the battle. This is most commonly done for transport flyers who have no more models to deploy from reserves, heavily damaged flyers who the player doesn't want to lose, or flyers who have key models embarked within them that the player wishes to save. I have 4 flyers, 2 Dreadclaw drop pods and 2 Fire Raptor gunships. I am going to bring them all onto the table on my turn 1, giving each of them one of the combat assignments. In the reserve subphase, I roll 4 separate aerial reserves tests, one for each of the flyers, looking for 3+. I pass all 4 tests. Because I have passed their tests, I must now give them each a combat mission. Dreadclaw A will perform a drop mission for one of my tactical squads also in reserves. Dreadclaw B will perform an extraction mission for one of my despoiler squads which is routed and appears to be in danger. Fire Raptor A will perform a strike mission, and Fire Raptor B will perform a strafing run. Once the assignments are given, I place each of my flyers on a board edge within my deployment zone. If this was turn 2 or after, I could place them on any board edge. My opponent now has the chance to use his Intercept reaction. He chooses to intercept Dreadclaw A with a heavy support squad and Fire Raptor B with another heavy support squad. His shots at the Dreadclaw are rolled as snapshots. He fires 5 last cannons at the flyer, but misses with 4 and inflicts only 2 damage. The flyer survives. His shots at the Fire Raptor are made at full ballistic skill. As the Fire Raptor is performing a strafing run, it is moving much slower and is an easier target. He fires 5 last cannons at it and scores 4 hits. Luckily, only 2 penetrate the flyer's armour. It's alive but very badly wounded. With all the intercept reactions done, I move to the movement phase. In the move subphase, I move all of my flyers in a straight line up to their maximum movement value. They cannot turn or pivot, so I was especially careful in placing them facing where I wanted them to go. Fire Raptor B is an exception. As it's on a strafing run, it can only move up to half of its movement value, but it does not need to move in a straight line, so it can turn and pivot. Dreadclaw A immediately disembarks its tactical squad onto the field using its base as the entry point. The squad can then move their full movement distance in line with rules for disembarking. My opponent uses another reaction to pull a squad away from my flyer. Dreadclaw B ends its movement right next to the fleeing despoilers. All the models in the unit are within 2 inches of the Dreadclaw and so can immediately embark within it, even though they are statused. I remove them from the table. They are now embarked upon Dreadclaw B. In the safety of the transport, they immediately lose their routed status. Fire Raptor A has an enemy Predator in its sights and fires all 4 of its centerline mounted Tempest rockets. These are fired as snapshots. 1 misses, but 3 hit the enemy tank dead center and penetrate its armour. It explodes after suffering a massive 9 damage. Fire Raptor B meanwhile fires all of its Hellstrike missiles into an enemy Land Raider, while its autocannon sponsons shoot enemy squads on either side of it. The missiles smash into the Land Raider, destroying it completely, while several Marines fall to the assault. One of the enemy squads however returns fire and removes the Fire Raptor's last few remaining hull points. It explodes in the air and is removed as a casualty. At the end of the shooting phase, all 3 surviving flyers return to aerial reserves, ready to be tested again in my next reserve subphase. Each will be given a new combat assignment, or at this point I can remove them from play without counting as casualties. I choose to remove Dreadclaw B along with the squad within it. They are safely off the board and do not count as casualties. Every time a flyer returns to aerial reserves, the airspace will become more and more difficult for it to navigate as enemy fire intensifies and anti-air stitches the sky with flak. For this reason, every time a flyer is placed back into aerial reserves, the difficulty of its next aerial reserves test will be increased by 1. So if a flyer successfully comes onto the table on turn 1 on a 3+, its next aerial reserves test will be a 4+. If it succeeds again in a subsequent turn, then the test will become 5+. The hardest an aerial reserves test will ever be is 6+. This includes flyers that come on as part of a combat air patrol, as the flyer comes onto the table and then returns to aerial reserves. It is the returning to aerial reserves that triggers the increase to the test. This however is not a blanket change to all aerial reserves tests, just the individual flyer itself. If you have multiple flyers, then you should track what is required for each one individually. I have 3 flyers in aerial reserves, 2 Dreadclaw drop pods and a Fire Raptor gunship. On turn 1, I roll an aerial reserves test for each of my individual flyers, needing a 3+ to pass. One of the Dreadclaws and the Fire Raptor passes their tests, while the second Dreadclaw fails. On my turn, both Dreadclaw A and the Fire Raptor come onto the table and perform their combat assignments, while Dreadclaw B remains in aerial reserves. After their missions are completed, both flyers return to aerial reserves. In my next turn, I will test again for all 3. Dreadclaw A and the Fire Raptor now need 4+ to pass, while Dreadclaw B still requires a 3+, having not been deployed and returned to aerial reserves. I pass all of their tests, entering play and then returning to aerial reserves once more. Dreadclaw A and the Fire Raptor will now need 5+ to enter play again, and Dreadclaw B a 4+. Units can react to flyers just like any other vehicle, with some key changes. The 2 most common methods of reacting to flyers is using either the Intercept reaction or the Combat Air Patrol reaction. Both of these reactions are aggressive attack reactions which look to destroy the enemy flyer before it can complete its combat assignment. Intercept is an advanced reaction that allows a unit to fire upon an enemy unit that is entering play from reserves, deep strike, or aerial reserves. To use the Intercept reaction, the reacting unit needs both line of sight and be in range of the model or unit entering play from aerial reserves. Although the flyer is in the air, your reacting unit still needs to be able to see what it is shooting. To use Intercept, perform the following steps. Once the flyer has been placed onto the table in your opponent's reserve subphase, declare that you want to make an Intercept reaction. Immediately pay 1 reaction point for the unit making an Intercept reaction. Remember that multiple units can react to the same thing. If I wanted 2 units to intercept, then I would pay 2 reaction points. The reacting unit then makes shooting attacks against the incoming flyer following all the normal rules for making shooting attacks. All of these shots, however, will be made as snapshots. Vehicles can also intercept, but may only fire their defensive weapons at the flyer. If the flyer is deployed on a strafing run combat mission, then your intercept shots will be made at full ballistic skill. If the flyer's hull points are reduced to 0, then it is removed from play as a casualty. If it survives, then your opponent's turn continues as normal. The intercepting unit can only shoot the flyer that triggered the reaction, no other model or unit. If the flyer is destroyed before the intercepting unit gets to make its shooting attack, then it does not fire, but it still uses up a reaction point. The intercept reaction is excellent at hitting a flyer before it can complete any part of its mission, but as your shots are mostly snapshots, it can be inconsistent. In particular, look for weapons with the Rapid Tracking and Skyfire special rules. Rapid Tracking allows a vehicle to fire a weapon as an intercept reaction even if it is not a defensive weapon. Skyfire, meanwhile, allows attacks made with that weapon to be made at full ballistic skill when firing at flyers. The Mastodon's Sky Reaper battery is an excellent example of this, firing 6 Strength 7 shots at full ballistic skill at flyers with a damage of 2 each. The next reaction is the Combat Air Patrol reaction. Combat Air Patrol is an advanced reaction that allows a flyer you own to fly in and fire upon an enemy flyer that has moved onto the table after deploying from aerial reserves. First of all, to use this reaction, you must have a valid model that can utilise it. Your model must have both the flyer subtype and the interceptor trait in its profile. If it has both, then it can perform a Combat Air Patrol. It does not need to pass an aerial reserves test to perform this reaction. Once you have an appropriate model selected, then perform the following steps. Once the enemy flyer has completed its movement in the move subphase, but before it has embarked or disembarked any models, declare that you wish to make a Combat Air Patrol reaction. This includes if the flyer chooses not to move. Immediately, pay 1 reaction point for the model making a reaction. Remember that multiple models can react to the same thing. If you want 2 models to fly Combat Air Patrols, then you would pay 2 reaction points. Remember that all reacting models need the flyer subtype and the interceptor trait. Place the reacting model on any board edge facing in the direction of the enemy flyer. Then move the reacting model up to its maximum movement characteristic following all the rules for moving flyers. The reacting model then makes a single shooting attack against the incoming flyer following all the normal rules for making shooting attacks. As both models are in the air, you do not require line of sight but do need to be in range with your weapons. If the enemy flyer's hull points are reduced to 0, then it is removed from play as a casualty. If it survives, then your opponent's turn continues as normal. The intercepting unit can only shoot the flyer that triggered the reaction, no other model or unit. If the flyer is destroyed before the intercepting unit gets to make a shooting attack, then it does not fire but still uses up a reaction point. After your shooting attack is completed, your flyer is immediately removed from the table and returned to aerial reserves. Note, this will impact any future aerial reserves tests you need to make with that model. The Combat Air Patrol is excellent at downing enemy flyers and can be more consistent than the intercept reaction. However, as it happens after movement, it does mean that the enemy still has a chance to drop off units their flyer may be carrying to where they need to get them. If one of your transport flyers is destroyed with a unit embarked within it, then the passengers are at a very great risk. If at any point a transport flyer with embarked models is destroyed and removed as a casualty, then complete the following steps. First of all models must complete an emergency disembarkation. Before the flyer is removed from play, place every model of the embarked unit in base-to-base contact with the flyer's base and at least 1 inch away from enemy models. If at any point a model cannot be placed in base-to-base contact with the flyer, then it can be placed in base-to-base contact with another model from the same unit, so long as it is still 1 inch away from an enemy model. If at any point your model cannot be placed due to terrain, enemy models or a board edge, then your model is immediately removed as a casualty. Next, roll a d6 for each model in the unit that is performing an emergency disembarkation. On a roll of a 2+, the model survives and remains in place. If a 1 is rolled, then the model immediately suffers a wound with an AP of 2 and a damage characteristic of 2. No cover or damage mitigation rolls can be made against this wound, but vulnerable saves can be made. After all surviving models have been tallied, the unit must immediately pass a cool check. If this has failed, then the unit is immediately pinned. The flyer is then removed from the table as a casualty. The rules for flyers are straightforward and compact, but as with any game system, there are areas of inconsistency that may lead to friction. These stem primarily from 4 areas: aerial reserve tests and combat missions, which we have already discussed, reacting against flyers, shooting at flyers, and emergency disembarking from flyers. Alongside both the Intercept and Combat Air Patrol reactions, the book does not specifically state that other reactions cannot be taken against flyers. So rules is written, you can move away from a flyer in the movement phase and shoot at a flyer that shoots at you in the shooting phase. The book is very specific about the Intercept reaction being made as snapshots, or shooting at flyers completing a strafing run at full ballistic skill, but it becomes a bit woolly about how shots should be completed in other scenarios such as the return fire reaction. I'm not going to use a valuable Intercept reaction or a Combat Air Patrol if my 10-man last cannon squad can simply return fire at full ballistic skill. And finally, the book describes emergency disembarking from flyers as part of the drop mission combat assignment, but nowhere else. This leaves quite a gap between. Does a person simply use the emergency disembark rules for normal vehicles, the drop mission rules, or does the embarked unit simply get destroyed? Until Games Workshop FAQ the above, I think a common sense approach is the best route forward. Passing an aerial reserves test means the flyer is eligible to enter play, but a player can choose not to. All reactions are allowed against flyers. Anytime a shooting attack is made against a flyer, it is always a snapshot, unless this is superseded by a special rule, as part of a Combat Air Patrol, or the flyer is on a Strafing Run mission. And if a transport flyer is destroyed at any point, then always follow the emergency disembark process described in the drop mission combat assignment. The previous points are the approach my community would take, but yours may differ. As ever, I would always have a chat with your opponent prior to playing to make sure you're both on the same page and there are no feel bad or gotcha moments due to misunderstanding. Once Games Workshop have updated or released an FAQ, I will update on this channel. And that is the fundamentals of flyers. Please call out with any questions or feedback in the comments below. If you see something that doesn't seem quite right, please leave a comment with the appropriate page number of the correct rule in the rulebook or PDF so I can keep myself right. Thank you very much for watching.